The idea of Russo-Ukrainian fraternity is strong in Vladimir Putin's mind and policy. Ukrainians are younger brothers who need to be brought into line. Are they? Of course. Is this myth still strong enough to sustain a destructive or indeed genocidal war? They all want to be Russians, deep down, don't they? Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
The notion that Ukraine and Russia are brotherly nations is a misconception largely propagated by the Kremlin propaganda. This narrative has been used to manipulate historical perceptions and diminish Ukraine's significance. In fact, there is a number of reasons why both countries are far from brotherly. Ukraine and Russia have followed different historical trajectories. While Russia evolved from the Grand Duchy of Moscow, Ukraine's history is deeply rooted in the Kievan Rus, a medieval state that had a significant impact on Eastern European culture and politics. Ukraine has a long history of striving for political independence, from the Cossack Hetmanate to the Declaration of Independence in 1991. Ukraine has consistently sought to establish itself as a sovereign nation. A significant turning point in Russian-Ukrainian relations was the Orange Revolution of 2004. This mass protest movement, sparked by a rigged presidential election, led to the victory of pro-European candidate Viktor Yushchenko. Putin's support for the pro-Kremlin candidate Viktor Yanukovych backfired, fueling anti-Russian sentiment in Ukraine. The Kremlin's response was a coordinated propaganda campaign that vilified Ukraine and its leader, further widening the divide between the two nations. On February 24, 2022, Putin's actions have shattered any remaining illusions of a brotherly relationship between Russia and Ukraine. The war has led to a historic shift in attitudes towards Moscow, even in areas that were once considered pro-Russian. The war has united Ukrainians in their resistance against Russian aggression and has solidified their national identity. Kyiv's determination to defend its sovereignty and independence has been met with widespread international support, further isolating Russia on the global stage.
I'm delighted to welcome Bartłomiej Kot, who is the Programme Director at the Warsaw Security Forum. Welcome to the programme once more.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to be discussing the Russo-Ukrainian myths about their unity. Before we came on, you mentioned a very interesting opinion poll that was taken in 2023, was it, in Ukraine about this relationship. Can you just briefly outline the key findings?
Because I was actually thinking about what was the change in the perspective from the Ukrainian side when it comes to Russia as such, and Russians as part of the same nation, the brotherhood nations, whatever you call it, and whatever that was used in the Russian propaganda. This statement was used in Russian propaganda, and people were asked in Ukraine. That was Rozumkov Center who actually published the poll. People were asked the question whether you feel that Ukrainians and Russians were ever in the past the part of this duo of brotherhood nations, or are they still a part of it? Whether that was the truth in the past, whether that would be a truth right now or in the future. And what was surprising to me, it was actually that even after the invasion, the full-scale invasion right now, there is still around 50% of people who would say that yes, in the past there was a time in which Ukrainians and Russians were a part of the brotherhood of nations. So this still is somewhere rooted in their thinking about Russians. It is not true anymore, because most of the people would say that it won't be the case in the future, or it is not the case right now. But the question whether that was true in the past, still 50% of people would say yes, it was true at some point of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia.
Is that more? Is that a mystical origin? Is that a mystical sort of mythos about these two nations, or is this just a recognition of the economic importance of Ukraine to the Soviet Union? Without the Ukraine, the Soviet Union, Russia is just a big poor country without the riches that we see in Ukraine.
Well, if you take a perspective of history and where that's actually, because I do consider that rather as a political narrative to some degree, because it was used as a political narrative, not only by Putin, not only by Soviet Union at some point, but also way back into the Russian Empire times. And if you treat it as a part of the political narrative, it actually, as I said, it goes beyond only the time of Soviet Union. During the Soviet Union, there was this idea of the brotherly nations that actually was very well embedded into this narrative about Ukrainians and Russians being a part of the brotherhood. But it wasn't something which was invented by Soviet Union as such. It was a part of the broader narrative of how nations during the times of communists should cooperate with each other, why they are a part of the USSR as such. But it goes way beyond that, and it is actually deeply rooted in the Tsarist, I would say, the Tsarist idea of not only Russians, not only Ukrainians, but also Belarusians being a part of the triune nation. That this is like, that all these three Eastern Slavic nations are indeed a part of one concept, one nation as such, and they were only divided because of some, either the Western impact of, for example, Polish activity in the Eastern Europe, or there were somehow influenced by, for example, also the Austro-Hungarian ideas of nations in this part of Europe, of rising the identity of nations in this part of Europe. So it is way deeper, in my opinion, because the Soviet Union, when it came to the point of trying to give the reasoning why Ukraine would become a part of the USSR, after actually Lenin seized the existence of the Ukrainian independent state in the very early 20s of the 20th century, it actually dug up the idea of the concept that was there already present during it was present as a part of the imperial narrative of Russia, of Tsarist Russia. The Soviets used that, and actually Putin also used that very recently, just before the invasion.
Starts off every interview with a journalist from the 8th century.
Well, yes,
proposes
that's true. Of course, he used that in this famous narrative that was broadcasted to the American audience. But it was also used by him in an article that was published just before the invasion, when he was strictly referring to the idea of the triune nation, even not mentioning necessarily the Soviet narrative into that, but rather actually referring to the very old Tsarist narrative about the position of Russia and the position of greater Russians towards the little Russians, as you may call them, like in his own narrative in the south and southwest part of his concept of where what the borders of Russia shall be. So, in his opinion, it's a bit of a broader concept of where he puts the lines of the influence of Russianness in a sense, and therefore not recognizing the separate identity of the Ukrainian nation.
Well, this is the interesting point, isn't it? The identity of the Ukrainian nation, the state. They are tearing down old Tsarist era statues, for example. All sorts of ructions going on in the Orthodox Church. The calendar has been changed. How is Ukraine forming its separate identity? Okay, if you get attacked, you rally around the flag in a way. What's the current state of Ukrainian historiography, as you know, as far as you can guess, about how the Ukrainians see themselves? Do they see themselves as heirs to the Cossacks, heirs to the Vikings, this north-south axis that Professor Timothy Snyder talked about, the Poles and the Lithuanians? Where do they see themselves?
First of all, the idea of the nationhood, the idea of nationhood in terms of even the political narratives right now in Ukraine, it is very strong for the obvious reasons that you stated. It is also a point of reference towards the policies that are adopted right now. in order also that's very obvious to boost the morale of the people.
Yes, you have to fight for something.
And also, but also to counteract the negative narrative that is coming directly from the Russian side, because the Russian propaganda is using that notion of triune nation and undermining the fact of Ukrainian identity. So that's very obvious that Ukrainians are referring to the idea of nationhood as a strong denominator of their own identity. But at the same time, there are of course a couple of, maybe more than only a couple of roots back in the history that they can use for the sake of as a point of reference for their own strong identity. This is not only the state of Khmelnytsky at some point. This is not only the start of of Ukraine independence in a very short but very symptomatic time just before Ukraine was incorporated into the USSR, and this is not only the Kievan Rus, and actually the fact that they're right now very fondly talking about the mere fact that Ukraine, in that sense, would have this the Ukrainian statehood would be way older than the one of Muscovy. So all these traits, the historical traits, are there in the narratives the Ukrainians are using for the sake of boosting the morale, but also showing to the world that Ukraine is not the concept. It is not the concept that was delivered at some point by the USSR, as would actually Putin like to, because he's saying that Ukraine was invented, in a sense, by Khrushchev at some point when he was putting the border,
yes.
The lines of border within the USSR. And it wasn't also not invented, in a sense, by the internal divisions and the internal history of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, because that would be another narrative that some people can actually also refer to. Thinking that Ukraine is only the product of the borderlands of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth,
which is Western Ukraine, generally speaking, is that?
So Ukraine has its own identity that derives from the fact that history-wise it had a different perspectives. It had different roots. It had different history that some of the parts of not only Russia at some point or Tsarist Russia at some point not only separate to Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but it also has this older traditions dating back to Middle Ages or even beyond early Middle Ages. Let me put it that way. So Kievan Rus, and I guess for anyone who was ever in Kiev, that's very obvious when they see monasteries, etc., They get the feeling that it is way older than only the idea that was brought up by anyone in the Politburo in Moscow. The truth is, however, that there are still certain parts of the common history between especially Poland, Lithuania, Belarus and Lithuania and Ukraine that, in my opinion, were not necessarily properly incorporated into this modern day of Ukraine, thinking about the state itself.
Narratives and histories often aren't the same thing, but fascinating topic. Thank you very much, Bartłomiej Kot, for coming into the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great to have you. So that's all we have time for today. As usual, join us again next time for How We Got Here.